This is the PowerPoint for Chapter 2, The Extent, Theories, and Factors of Victimization. So first we're going to talk a little bit about how crime is measured. So we have a few of the major measures of crime in the United States. The UCR, or the Uniform Crime Report, the NCVS, the National Crime Victimization Survey, NIBRS, or the National Incident-Based Recording System, and self-reported data. So first we're going to talk a little bit about the UCR, or the Uniform Crime Report. So this is the oldest measure of crime. So it started in the 1930s, and we just recently stopped using it in about 2020. So as of 2021, it's now phased out, and we do not use the UCR anymore. So this is produced by the FBI, and it's collected and turned in by individual police departments. So the FBI defines crimes by two categories. So first are the index crimes, or the very serious crimes, and the non-index crimes, so maybe crimes that aren't as serious. So the UCR index offenses, we have 4 violent crimes. So the first is a category of murder and non-negligent manslaughter, forcible rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. And we also have 4 property offenses, so burglary, motor vehicle theft, larceny, and arson. So although we don't use the UCR anymore, we just very recently stopped using it, so we still want to talk a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses, and maybe use some of those weaknesses to kind of explain why we don't use the UCR anymore. So its first strength is that it's a long, systematic way of measuring crime in the United States. It goes all the way back to the 1930s, so we can look at crime over almost a century, almost 100 years. There's 2 offenses that are almost always reported. So murder and motor vehicle theft are 2 offenses that we have a very, very good idea about how much of these 2 crimes actually exist in the United States. There's not a lot of murders that are underreported, and not a lot of motor vehicle thefts that are unreported as well. The reason for that being that, well, if your car gets stolen and you want insurance to buy you a new car, you have to report it as stolen. So the UCR was very good at keeping track of these 2 offenses. It's great for examining crime prior to 1970 because it was really the only thing we had before 1970. So it's really good to sort of historically go back and look at crime. But it has a lot of weaknesses, and these weaknesses are why we phase this out and we do not use this anymore. So the first major weakness is the hierarchy rule. So say there's one crime event where someone breaks into somebody's house and assaults them and steals something and maybe drove away drunk or something like that. So a multitude of crimes take place here. Well, under the UCR would only count as an aggravated assault. So there's all these other crimes that happened as well, but we don't count them. We only count the most serious crime. And a crime against the person is always going to be considered more serious than a crime against property or theft. So another weakness is that the police departments are the ones who do the reporting. So our sort of accuracy of how much crime is taking place is only as good as the police departments keeping track of this. So a lot of times they aren't very good at keeping track of how many crimes are taking place, and a lot of times they don't even submit this information to the FBI, so we can't really even see how much crime is actually taking place. And it only counts crime that comes to the attention of the police. So lots of crime we're going to talk about the reasons in a minute, but a lot of crime goes unreported. Like over half of crime goes unreported. So this only counts the crime that police actually know about. It doesn't collect info on crime victims at all. So only the crime events themselves. It doesn't say, characteristics of the victim. So we don't really get to see the full extent of these crime events if we don't get to know about the victims. Okay, so as of 2021, we are in the process of switching over to the National Incident-Based Reporting System. And this system was in use for a couple decades already, but now it's completely taken over, and we use it instead of using the UCR. So this is also an FBI crime measure, and it also is collected by police departments and submitted to the FBI. So one of the benefits that this has over the UCR is that it's much, much more detailed. So it contains offender and victim characteristics, so we get a sort of more complete look at the criminal event. And it covers a lot wider range of events. So it adds drug offenses and public order offenses, which are usually seen as, more minor crimes compared to these violent crimes and, serious property offenses. So we now keep track of 46 different crimes and 22 different offense categories. So all offenses in a single event are recorded. So if, someone breaks into your house, assaults you, steals something, and then drives drunk away, it's going to record every one of those rather than only the most serious crime. So, however, it still only records offenses known to the police. So there's still all these crimes out there that, the police don't know about, and we do not get to include in the NIBRs. Okay, so these offenses that the police do not know about is called the dark figure of crime. And you'll see this little figure here. We call this the crime funnel. If 1,000 crimes are committed, maybe about 500 of those crimes are reported or detected by the police. And out of those, only about 100 crimes end in the arrest of a suspect. So maybe 10% out of every, out of 1,000 crimes. And this number really depends on the crime itself. So something like sexual assault has a very high dark figure of crime. So for a multitude of different reasons that we'll talk about in a minute, a lot of people do not report being sexually assaulted to the police. Compared to something like auto theft that, we just talked about. If your car is insured and you want your insurance to buy you a new car, if yours gets stolen, you're going to have to report this. So auto theft would have a very small dark figure of crime, where sexual assault has a very large dark figure of crime. Okay, and some of the reasons that victims of crime don't report to the police. They might just believe that it's not serious or nothing will be done, especially if it's like a very minor theft offense, like maybe, someone steals your iPhone or something. You might not report that. You just think, oh, well, it's kind of my fault. I'm just going to go buy a new iPhone and be more careful next time. Oftentimes a victim has a lack of trust in the CJ system. Victims of crime are not always treated with, the most respect. And if they don't trust that, the criminal justice system will treat them with respect, or trust that the criminal justice system will believe them, then they're probably not going to report their victimization. The victim might not even realize that a crime took place. So maybe someone had broken into their house and stolen a piece of jewelry. Maybe that's all they stole and they just never realized that they were burglarized. A lot of the times a victim is also involved in offending. So we call this a victim-offender overlap. So say a victim is burglarized and they're also, selling drugs or something, and the offender steals their drug stash. Well, they're probably not going to go to the cops with that. There's also victimless crimes. So these could be things like prostitution, drug use, these things that you don't really believe that or see a victim, so no one is there to report the victimization. There's also a fear of retaliation. If someone is, say, assaulted by somebody or robbed by somebody, they may fear that if they report, they're going to come back and be assaulted even worse. Okay, so our next measure of crime is a National Crime Victimization Survey. So this doesn't ask the police what crimes they've, come across. It asks the victims themselves. So these are crimes that are not necessarily always reported to the police. So how this is done is it's collected from 43,000 households, so once every 6 months for 3 years, and then the households get rotated off and new households come on. And it's a very, very long-standing survey, very sort of complex. They're sampling. We're not necessarily going to go into that. It's not a research methods class, but it's a probability sample. So we're getting sort of like the best representation of households in the United States. And they will call and visit these households and ask them what victimization experiences they've had in the past 6 months. So they will ask somebody in the household that is age 12 and older, so children aren't included, and it will just ask you, it just asks about different victimization experiences, whether that be property crime, violent crime, things like fraud, etc., etc. So the victimization survey shows that there's about 3 times more crime than what is found in the UCR. So a lot of crime, about 2/3, does not get reported to police. It has a 90% completion rate, which is very good. So 90% of the people that are, part of this survey actually complete the data. So we have very good data for this. And it really addresses this dark figure of crime that is not reported to police. Again, high completion rate gets at the dark figure. Weaknesses. A series of victimizations might be undercounted. So if someone is a victim more than one time, maybe they are a victim of domestic violence and they are victimized maybe once a week, they might undercount that. 2 groups are not accounted for, so children, so those 12 and under, and then homeless individuals as well, since it's calling households, they're not going to be part of the survey. It doesn't include businesses, so we don't see things that happen in businesses. Mostly would be theft and property damage, etc. It does not collect on homicide. Obviously, the victim is not around to complete the survey. And it doesn't collect on victimless crimes, so drug use and prostitution. There's also, a problem with the reliability of victim accounts. Victims might not, they usually don't lie, but they might not remember exactly what happened. So telescoping is a big problem. When something that is obviously traumatizing happens to you, it might seem that it happened a little bit more recently than it actually did. So maybe someone will say, oh yeah, I was on the subway and some guy grabbed my purse and ran away with it. Well, they might say that happened 6 months ago, but it could have been 2 years ago and they just, remember pretty vividly. So they telescope and therefore provide some inaccurate information. Another type of study that we use to look at the extent of crime is self-report studies. So this is when an individual reports the extent of their own victimization. So there's no one systematic study providing a yearly estimate of crime in the United States. This is more so individuals, usually funded by grant money, whether that be from a government grant or a nonprofit. Individual researchers or research groups will, conduct a study seeing the extent of victimization in a population. Again, it does get at the dark figure of crime. And they are surprisingly accurate. So people don't tend to, lie on these self-report studies. It might seem, well, they can make things up, but generally they do seem to be pretty accurate. So if we want to talk about which one of these, methods is best to use, whether it be the police data, the victim data, or these self-report studies on, how crime and victimization, the best practice is to use data triangulation. So this means to look at all 3 of these types of studies, the police, the NCVS, and these self-report studies, to really get at exactly how much crime is taking place. Okay, so now we want to talk a little bit about the current extent of victimization. So this is being recorded in 2022, and if we want to look at what, the crime statistics look like for the previous year, 2021, well, we have a big problem here. So because of the switchover from the UCR to NIBRS, there's a huge problem with department participation. So a lot of, police agencies are switching over to this new system, and they just haven't submitted their data yet. So there's about 60% that have submitted their crime data, but a lot of large police departments, I believe New York City and Los Angeles are in these departments here, have not, submitted their data for 2021 yet. So really, we do not have any idea about what crime looks like. There was also problems with the NCVS data collection during the COVID lockdowns. So even our NCVS data is, really shaky right now. So hopefully in a couple years, this gets, figured out, and we really, get a better picture on the crime, because, we had a big historical event in 2020. And it, researchers are estimating that it did, affect crime rates a little bit. So it's going to be interesting to see in a few years exactly, the extent of crime post-COVID. But we do know that crime has been steadily decreasing since the mid-1990s. But then again, we do not know if this trend is continuing. As of 2022, some experts are saying that yes, crime is increasing. But that might be sort of anecdotal. We just don't know yet. So the latest NCVS data is available from 2020. So from 2019 to 2020, violent victimization declined 22%, which seems like a huge drop. But we really have to think about the data that was collected then. So this is really driven by simple assault. And we know that, bars were not open, restaurants weren't open, there was no concerts and sporting events. And this is, areas where a lot of these simple assaults take place. So maybe the lockdown is, the reason for this decline of 22%. Again, property crimes declined 19%. During 2020, a lot of stores were closed. People were in their homes, so it was, harder to burglarize a home when people are in it. So this could be, an artifact of the COVID lockdowns. We're just really not too sure yet. Reports of intimate partner violence to law enforcement decreased 51%. So you might say, wow, a huge decrease in, IPV. But unreported IPV remained the same as in 2019. So here we see that the same amount of intimate partner violence, maybe even a little bit more, is going on in 2020. It's that people are not reporting intimate partner violence to the police during the COVID lockdowns. So this is just a little graph from the NCVS 2019 to 2020, and we can see, the changes here. Where we see, oh wow, it looks like there's a pretty dramatic decrease in violent crime. It probably was an artifact of the COVID lockdowns, and we see this probably going back to normal, maybe even increasing a little bit in the present time. Okay, so making sense of these sort of low victimization rates, or this 22% drop. Again, in-person interviewing for the NCVS was stopped during the COVID lockdown. So we're just simply not asking as many people their victimization. Most interviews happened over the phone rather than in person. And these phone interviews might be a little bit harder to, build rapport with people and really get the full extent of their victimization. Maybe they just weren't telling the interviewers about it. Response rate dropped from 71% to 63% before rising back up to 72% after this lockdown. So during this COVID lockdown, people, were either sick or had, more important things to do than to take part in the survey. So that might be another reason why we see such a dramatic decrease. Again, people are not reporting. When it comes to domestic violence, you're not going to report domestic violence if you're stuck in the same house as somebody and, can't leave or can't go anywhere else. They might fear retaliation. Again, everyone was in really close quarters, and you're not going to want to call the police on your spouse if they're, abusing you, if you still have to live with them. Again, maybe it's not a main concern during the pandemic. The thought that these police officers have way more important things to deal with. People are dying everywhere. Hospitals are full. I don't want to, bug the police officers with my problems when there's more important things going on. And then people just not engaging in risky lifestyles. Again, they're, not going to these concerts and these bars, they're staying at home, and they might be sort of protected from victimization. Okay, so now that we've talked about how victimization is measured, we're going to talk a little bit about the victims themselves and who is, most likely to be a victim. So we have what we call the typical victim, and the typical victim and the typical offender share many of the same characteristics. So generally, they're young, usually, teenage to early 20s, mid 20s, 15 to 25 probably, male. They're usually of a racial or ethnic minority. They usually live in a disadvantaged urban area, and their peers are usually involved in offending. This does not mean that every sort of crime, type of crime follows this, but when we're seeing the sort of typical violent and property offenses, these are, the usual victims. One thing is that there's a huge overlap between offending and victimization. So those that commit criminal offenses are more likely to be victims than those that do not. So a huge overlap here. One of those things might just be risky lifestyles. So people that are involved in offending are also, around other offenders. They're involved in risky things. They're doing risky things at risky times, and therefore more likely to be a victim. Retaliation, again, the victim might, being a victim might make you retaliate and become an offender. So huge overlap there. A lot of the same sort of root causes in both. So abuse in childhood, psychological consequences are huge for both, being a victim and being an offender. And a lot of the times we use criminological theories to explain victimization. So we take these theories of crime to explain why someone might commit a crime and use them to explain why someone might be a victim as well. So there's two sort of theories that we're going to talk about. The first is lifestyles theory. This is coined by Hindelang, Godfredson, and Garofalo in 1978. And they said that victimization is more likely when one's behavior or lifestyle puts them in vulnerable situations. So if you're working out of the home and engaging in these sort of leisure activities, you're going to be around, more people that might offend against you. The principle of homogamy, the more frequently one comes into contact with offenders, the more likely he or she is to be victimized. So if you spend every, weekend night inside watching movies at home, you're going to be less likely to be a victim than if you go out to the bars every weekend, because, when you're going out to the bars, you're going to be more likely to come into contact with, people that might either assault you or steal from you, etc. So risky choices might also be out of necessity. Some people, they live in a bad neighborhood with a high crime neighborhood because they simply can't afford to live anywhere else. Some people working the night shift might not, have the ability to work during the day, and, taking your own car home from work is probably more safer than taking the bus home, but some people, they can't afford to have their own car. So lifestyles theory we use quite a bit to explain why some people might be more likely to be victimized than others. Another theory that we use a lot in victimology is the routine activity theory. So this is coined by Cohen and Felsen around the same time, 1979. And they really they created this theory to explain why crime happens. But we can apply it to victimization, and it works really well to explain victimization as well. So this is likely when three elements converge in space and time. There's a likely offender, a suitable target, and the absence of a capable guardian. So where these three things converge, a crime is likely. Okay, so the likely offender. This is somebody that's motivated to commit a particular crime. So the routine activity theory doesn't really specify what motivates the person. It could be another theory of crime, such as maybe they have low self-control and are impulsive, or poverty, or any one of many explanations of crime. But the characteristic really depends on the crime type. So, if we think about a crime such as burglary, maybe burglary from a business after hours, this would be more likely to be committed by usually teenagers or maybe very like early 20s. But white collar offenses are usually committed by people in their 30s and 40s who have, the opportunity to have this sort of high powered, high status job and the opportunity to commit these white collar offenses. The next thing that is needed is a suitable target. So this is something that the offender wants. So there's so many different suitable targets, and what is a suitable target for one person is not a suitable target for another. So it really depends on the crime type. So whether it's a violent offense, a sexual offense, or property crime, these could, maybe it's an iPhone, maybe it's a woman walking home alone by herself and vulnerable, maybe it's a computer, maybe it's a house, maybe it's a bank account number. So this suitable target can be many things, and it's sort of different for every crime. The next thing you need is the lack of a capable guardian. So a guardian is often an adult, so maybe a parent, a teacher, a security guard, the police. However, it doesn't have to be a human. So if you have a large dog at home, that could, be a guardian. So it might be the reason that somebody does not break into your house is because you have a big dog. It could also be something like a security camera. It could be something as simple as a fence. It makes it more difficult to commit a crime. It could be a lock on a door. It could be a password on a computer. So again, oftentimes it is like, an adult such as a security guard or a parent or the police, but it does not have to be, and animals and, objects can also be capable guardians. Okay, so next we're going to talk a little bit about immigration and victimization. So there's the view that, immigration leads to more crime, but research has found that increases in immigration are not linked to an increase in crime at all. But undocumented immigrants are very vulnerable to victimization. They're much less likely to report their victimization, whether they're, fear of deportation, or they don't speak the language, or they just, don't really know where to go. So they are very vulnerable to victimization. They're also less likely to access health services. Again, they might not know that these services exist. They might not, be able to speak the language, or they're, fearful that they're going to be found out. So some research has documented that immigrant youth are a particular risk for being bullied in school. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about in this chapter is alcohol and victimization. So this is a sort of a huge factor in a lot of types of victimization. 36% of victims in the NCVS believe that the offender was under the influence of alcohol when they committed that crime. So alcohol also impedes one's ability to protect oneself. Crime victims also report that prior to their victimization, they had consumed alcohol or drugs prior to being victimized. And alcohol use might be a reason that somebody does not report a crime. So this is a huge factor in sexual assault reporting. If somebody is under the influence of alcohol when they are sexually assaulted, they will be less likely to go to the police just because they don't want to think that the police are not going to believe them or won't take them seriously. So a person who drinks at home alone with family is much less likely to be victimized than a person who drinks in a bar. So it's not necessarily the alcohol itself, but it could just be, the place and the people that you're around while you're drinking. So someone drinking at a bar is much more likely to come into contact with motivated offenders, and there's less likely to be capable guardianship there. If you think about these crowded bars, if you're here in Lubbock on Broadway, there's often not very many security officers and maybe don't know everything that's going on at the bar. So somebody who's also under the influence of alcohol might be seen as a suitable target. They might be seen as, maybe they're going to be easy to steal from or assault. This is not to say that alcohol is like, you can blame somebody if they've been drinking and are a victim of a crime. It's just something that we talk about as being a factor that is correlated with victimization, or, might be able to explain why one person is a victim and one is not a victim. So that's all that we're going to talk about in this PowerPoint, although there is a few more theories to look at in the textbook in Chapter 2.